The soldier had just stepped onto the front porch when he froze. His daughter was standing in handcuffs right outside their house with a police officer gripping her wrist. He didn't shout. He didn't beg. What he did next would make an entire police department lower their heads. So what had really happened to the little girl? Don't touch her if you don't understand what's going on. The voice wasn't loud or sharp, but it brought everything to a halt. Officer Maurice Kane still had his hand wrapped around Emily's wrist, but his eyes shifted slowly as if trying to size up the man who had just spoken. The man wore a worn military uniform. He didn't move like a panicked father, but like someone walking into an old battlefield. The only difference this time was that the bullets were coming from those who were supposed to protect. "Who are you?" Kane asked, still gripping the girl's wrist, even though her hand was trembling beneath his. The man didn't answer. He looked down at her dusty sandals, then at the child, her hands tied behind her back head, down hair soaked with sweat and fear. A pause hung in the air, as if the whole neighborhood had forgotten how to breathe. "Emily," he said, calling his daughter's name, his voice steady. "Lift your head." She didn't respond. Her small hands stayed locked behind her, her body curled inward like a baby bird caught in a strange wind. Her legs barely held her up, but she didn't fall. That courage didn't come from strength, but from memory, the memory of the man who had always shown up when she needed him most. "This child is uncooperative," Kane said loudly, making sure the neighbors could hear. "There are signs of a potential medical violation. I'm doing my job." This time, the man stepped forward. He didn't threaten anyone, but no one dared stop him. He calmly reached out, not to hit, not to snatch, but simply placed his hand on the officer's and squeezed gently. "Let go. Right now." Kane laughed, half mocking, half defiant, as if no one had ever dared to do such a thing. But the man didn't move his hand. His eyes remained on his daughter's wrist. A child remembers being handcuffed for the rest of her life, but a father who once held a gun to protect strangers can't just stand still when his daughter is being dragged through the street. "I'm her father," he finally said, "and I won't say it a third time." Beltran pulled his hand back, not out of fear, but because that look was unlike any he had ever encountered in the force. It wasn't the defiance of a criminal, nor the fear of a civilian. It was the look of someone who had crossed the line between life and death more than once and still chose to return. "What's your name?" Beltran asked, stepping back half a pace. "Michael Reese." Eric Dawson, the young rookie standing a few steps away, said nothing. He looked at Michael, then back at Beltran. The same question kept looping in his mind, one the academy had never taught in a moment like this: who is actually in the wrong? Emily lifted her head. Her eyes were wet not from pain, but from shame. Her voice trembled as she spoke softly, only loud enough for her father to hear. "Dad, I don't even know what I did wrong." Michael didn't answer right away. He unlocked the handcuffs from her wrists, moving slowly but deliberately. His hand wrapped gently around her small wrist, still warm from the red marks left behind. A woman nearby, a neighbor, spoke up, trying to keep her tone neutral. "Mr. Reese, I'm not taking sides, but the girl... I mean, I have kids too, you understand, and she looks like she might be sick." Michael didn't look at her. He simply pulled his daughter closer, placing his body between her and the rest of the world. Not because he was afraid of an attack, but because the world forgets compassion too easily. "I understand, and I hope your child never has to stand here like mine is today." Eric squared his shoulders as if about to speak, but Beltran's sharp glance cut toward him cold as a blade, and Eric fell silent. A few seconds later, he exhaled. Not loud enough to become a sentence, but enough for anyone paying attention to recognize one thing: integrity often begins with quiet resistance. "We're just doing our job," Beltran said loudly, eyes scanning the crowd for support. "We can't let emotions interfere with the law." Michael bent down and tied the strap of his daughter's sandal that had slipped loose. He said nothing. A small gesture, but more powerful than 1,000 words. "You don't have the right to use the law as a cover for what isn't right," he said calmly as he stood up. "I wear a uniform too. I know the difference between orders and conscience. And what my head chooses to listen to, that's the reason I'm still alive and standing here." Beltran clenched his jaw. He turned back toward his patrol car, not bothering to hide his frustration. "This isn't over," he muttered, but no one answered. Emily stood still, her eyes fixed on the house. She was trembling not from the cold, but from the feeling of being rejected by the world for the first time, without any reason. Michael bent down and lifted her into his arms, just like he had the first day he brought her home from the hospital. Eric took a few steps forward, as if he was about to say something, then stopped. Michael looked at him and gave a small nod. The soldier's eyes were steady and deep, speaking the words his mouth didn't need to. "You know this isn't right. The question is, where do you choose to stand?" Emily rested her head on her father's shoulder. Her little hand reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a piece of candy already soft from the warmth. She placed it into his hand and whispered, "For you, Daddy. I saved it for when you came back." Michael gently closed his hand around hers, then turned to look directly at Maurice Kane, who was now sitting in the patrol car, his eyes still scanning the rooftops. "I was a soldier," he said loudly. "I've faced men with guns, but today I had to face someone in uniform who made my daughter cry." No one said a word. No one stepped forward, only the sound of the old iron gate closing behind them. And then a quiet voice from the crowd, "Not everyone wearing a badge deserves to be called a protector of justice." Emily kept her head down, her hair covering nearly half of her face. The small plastic chair beneath her gave a faint squeak as she shifted to avoid her father's gaze. Michael sat across from her, still holding the towel he had dried his hands with earlier, but he didn't let go of it. The fabric was wrapped tightly around his fingers, almost like a habit to keep from facing the tight knot in his throat. His mind raced with questions, none of them gentle enough to speak aloud, and the silence between father and daughter grew so thick it felt like even Emily's uneven breaths could be heard cutting through it. "It just stings a little, Daddy." "Don't worry," Emily said. Her voice almost disappeared into the air between them. She wasn't crying and she wasn't complaining. Her eyes avoided his as if she was hiding from her own feelings. They darted sideways like they were trying to keep something much bigger than skin-deep pain from being seen. Michael reached for the medicine bottle, unscrewing the cap slowly, as if afraid to wake something fragile resting on his daughter's wrist. His hands, once calloused from gripping a rifle in moments of life and death, were now timid as they hovered near her skin. The bruise was still there, a round purplish mark like an unwanted brand. These were the same hands that had once dressed wounds on fellow soldiers in the field, but now they fumbled in front of a child, learning how to survive in the middle of a city. The creases on Michael's forehead weren't from fatigue or anger, but from something heavier, grief and helplessness. Deep down, every soldier carries the quiet fear of having to watch someone they love get hurt, not in war, but in peacetime. It isn't a rain of bullets that breaks them, it's the indifference of those who look on and do nothing. Emily pushed her bowl of soup aside without meeting his eyes. "I don't want to eat. I feel tired. Today, I made you ashamed." Michael lifted his head. "You didn't do anything wrong, Emily. What's wrong is the way people looked at you without even asking." She didn't answer. She just sat there quiet and still, like she wanted to disappear. Tears welled up in her eyes, but they didn't fall. They stayed there, clinging to her lashes like tiny drops of morning dew. A 5-year-old shouldn't have to grow used to being judged. She shouldn't be made to think that just being there could bother someone. Michael didn't rush to pull her into his arms. He knew that some kinds of pain have to be spoken out loud to ease, just like you have to take a breath after a hard fall. He waited. He had learned through years lived at the edge of life and death that patience is also a form of love. At the park the other day, there were 2 girls playing on the swings, you know. Emily's voice cracked but stayed steady. I went over and asked if they wanted to play. One of them looked at my hand and whispered something. They said I had something dirty. They said if I touched them, their skin would turn white like mine. Michael didn't interrupt. What he hadn't heard before, he listened to now with his heart. A father doesn't need to explain, he just needs to be there when his child finally says what they've been holding in for too long. He had been through many battles, but he had never fought in one where his own daughter was the one who got hurt. I turned around, but I heard them laughing. It wasn't like cartoon laughs, Daddy. It made my stomach hurt. I don't know why, but it really hurt. It was a long time before he spoke. His voice was deep like an old bolero song drifting through a memory. Some people believe only what they see. Others take time to understand what they've never known. There are more of the first kind, but it's the second kind that changes the world. Emily didn't say anything, but she reached for the soup bowl again. Not because she was hungry, but because she realized she didn't need to be hungry to be loved. A child eating again, not from need, but from knowing their parent is waiting, is the first sign of healing. Outside, there was a soft sound of footsteps. Michael opened the door just a crack. No one was there, but sitting neatly on the ground was a carton of milk and a folded note, the handwriting firm but unpolished. "I'm sorry for doing nothing. I didn't have the courage." He picked it up and read each word carefully, like reading the death notice of a fallen comrade. It wasn't the apology that shook him. It was the fact that someone had the courage to write down what they were afraid to admit. Then he looked across the street toward the house, where a pair of aged eyes slowly drew the curtain shut. Eyes that didn't step in, didn't speak up, just stood aside. The neighbors didn't ask questions. They didn't make comments. But Michael knew they had seen. And it was that silence that chilled him more than any scream ever could. Silence is never harmless, especially when it stands beside injustice. Before bedtime, Emily asked to sleep with her dad. She whispered, "Daddy, do I have to stay home tomorrow? Or are we going back to the clinic tomorrow? You're staying with me. No one's taking you anywhere unless I say so. No nurse, no police officer, nobody." She nodded softly, then drifted off. Her eyelids twitched a few times, like she was dreaming about something she couldn't quite name. Michael sat beside her bed for a long time. The light from the bedside lamp cast sharp shadows across his face, but his eyes had softened. He didn't think of himself as a great father, just as a man who never walked away from responsibility. Some men don't know how to lull a child to sleep, but they're willing to stay up all night to guard their child's dreams. And maybe that's enough to begin with. He pulled his phone from his shirt pocket and dialed a number he hadn't used in a long time. On the other end, someone picked up after 3 rings. "Hello, who is this?" "Do you still have Valeria's number? I need her. And this time, it's not for me. It's for my daughter." Emilio kept both hands on his knees, trying not to let them tremble. He couldn't tell what felt heavier, his untouched cup of coffee or the silence that hung in the air like a verdict from Sergeant Raymond Cook. In the small office with its shut window and an air conditioner wheezing like an old man with asthma, every other sound was swallowed whole. "You're new. Don't think you know more than someone who's been in this chair for 10 years? Raymond's voice wasn't loud or sharp. It was steady like a familiar knock on a door, the kind of tone that had been repeated too many times, like a parent's warning not to play near the stove. But his eyes were something else entirely. They didn't match the calm tone of his words. They were a silent, heavy warning. There was no space in that stare for doubt, and even less for choice. "I just thought you didn't see anything." Raymond cut him off, then slid a folder across the desk. It was just a kid being misunderstood. Maurice followed protocol. "And if you still think there's something worth reporting, consider this. Maurice isn't just anybody. He's protected. From the top." No one said another word. Emilio tilted his head slightly, a reflex, like trying to dodge a gaze too sharp to bear. He didn't agree, but he didn't argue either. He just wanted to leave the room before something inside him cracked open. His shoes made a faint scuff on the tiled floor as he stood, as if even they didn't want to disturb anyone. He bowed his head instead of speaking, a hollow gesture of politeness between people who no longer shared the same beliefs. The door clicked shut behind him, leaving behind a room that reeked of stale tobacco and the thick air of a kind of power that no longer persuaded. Down the hallway, Officer Mitch Sanders leaned against the wall, fiddling with his radio like he was tuning it for a game. He squinted, then smirked. It was hard to tell whether it was mockery or friendliness. "Emilio, I heard you're working on something. That report about the girl." Emilio didn't answer, but his steps slowed slightly. "Don't get yourself into trouble, kid. That pale little girl, maybe it's a skin condition, maybe something contagious, or maybe she was just born in the wrong family. Who knows? But you're not trying to be some kind of hero, are you? Emilio came to a full stop and turned back, though he didn't look Mitch in the eye. I'm just trying to understand what law we're really serving here. The law of silence, Mitch said with a wink, patting Emilio lightly on the shoulder. The law that keeps the chairs warm for the ones who plan to sit in them for a while. At his desk, Emilio turned on his computer and began typing out the report. He didn't write like someone filing a complaint. He wrote like someone afraid that if he didn't, the same thing would just keep happening until nobody even remembered the little girl who once trembled outside her own front door. As he was double-checking the unit code and cleaning up the grammar in the header, Maria Collins appeared with a stack of files. She quietly placed them on the desk, glanced at the screen, and spoke in a low voice. Capitalize the names. Include the full unit number. Don't let grammar mistakes mess up the message. He froze for a second, then looked up. I'm just a clerk, Emilio, but I'm also a mother, and I know what it feels like when someone makes your child cry and no one says anything. She didn't wait for a thank you. She walked away, right after leaving behind a faint trail of perfume and the marked-up draft she had quietly fixed. As the clock ticked past 12, Eric stepped out behind the building, carrying a piece of dry bread and a crumpled napkin. He didn't want to squeeze into the crowded cafeteria where certain glances often spoke louder than words. The old stone bench beneath the shade of a berry tree had grown familiar with him, quietly accepting his presence like it understood that some days all a person needed was silence. Soft footsteps approached behind him. A younger figure appeared. It was Jason, a colleague even newer than Eric, holding a cup of juice still beaded with condensation. He didn't say anything. He just set the cup beside him and sat down. The distance between their breathing was not too close, not too far, just enough to not feel alone. I got demoted once, Jason said quietly, because I questioned Kane about a house raid that hit the wrong address. No one believed me. After that, I learned to keep my mouth shut. But that day, when you stepped in, I saw something I used to hope this job still had. Eric looked at Jason without replying, but his hand, the one holding the pen, clenched tighter. Back at his desk, he printed the report. The paper was still warm. He couldn't bring himself to submit it just yet. In his mind, he saw Emily's face, those trembling eyes as if asking a question she hadn't yet learned how to name. That night, Eric brought the report home. He skipped dinner. He lit a candle by the stove and began rereading every line, correcting punctuation, scratching out one harsh phrase, rewriting it in simpler but clearer words. The gas flame in the stove flickered lower, its amber glow wavering like it hadn't yet decided whether to burn on or fade away. Eric held the printed pages in his hands, feeling the warmth of the paper as if it had a heartbeat of its own. He raised it toward the light, peering through each sentence like looking into his own reflection. For a moment, he tilted the paper toward the flame, like someone ready to burn away every last doubt. Then he froze. There wasn't a clear reason. His hand simply wouldn't let go. Maybe it was Emily's voice still echoing in his ears. Maybe it was Maria's eyes. Or maybe it was something deep within him finally beginning to believe that if truth could exist on paper, then maybe it could stand its ground, even among ashes. He set the report down and smoothed every corner as if trying to calm a quiet unrest. He took a deep breath, folded the paper, carefully slipped it between two folders, and zipped his briefcase shut. Nothing happened. No one clapped. No one nodded in approval. But somewhere inside him, something small remained intact. He didn't know if he'd still have a desk at the office tomorrow, but he knew that some things, if left unsaid, become long, slow cuts in the memory of the innocent. And memory, when left unconfirmed, turns into nothing more than the wind twisting through silent walls. One person can't change an entire system. Maybe he thought he could start by not forgetting. No one said each other's names that morning. There was no doorbell, no greetings. Eric simply stood there, his hand resting lightly on the weathered fence, then stepped into the small front yard, as if he were a piece of memory quietly returning. On the front steps, Michael sat upright. The old wooden chair creaked softly each time he shifted his weight. His gaze didn't turn when the gate closed behind Eric. But he knew. And Eric knew that he knew. You were standing there yesterday, Michael said, his voice neither harsh nor soft, just enough to sink into the chest. So why didn't you do anything? Eric froze for a long moment. He removed his cap, his fingers tracing the rim, as if searching for thoughts he hadn't quite formed. It was a while before he rested it on his knee, eyes still lowered, and quietly replied, I was trained to restrain people, but no one ever taught me what to do when the person who needs to be stopped is wearing the same uniform. Michael didn't respond, but Eric could feel the shift in the air like a tension string suddenly slack. A child ran barefoot across the cool tiled floor inside the house. Emily stood at the doorway. Her eyes passed briefly over Eric. No anger, no blame, just silence, as if asking, how long are you going to keep standing still? Eric was about to call out, but the girl had already turned away, leaving behind a silence heavier than any words. It wasn't the kind of silence meant to escape. It was a door closing because someone had arrived too late. Michael poured a glass of water and handed it to Eric. I once stood still too, he said, his voice dry like desert wind. A fellow soldier beat a detainee who couldn't fight back. I did nothing. He got promoted. I lost sleep every night. Wounds on a body can heal, but the wounds left by silence don't. Eric lowered his head. His hand trembled slightly as he placed the glass on his knee. His eyes wandered over the cracked concrete floor beneath his feet, the hairline fissures curling like silent etchings written by time and silence. Every fracture seemed to hold on to something no one dared say aloud, and each break whispered a truth the heart once tried to forget. A bird darted across the yard, brushing the fence, before soaring into the sky as if carrying something unsaid. Michael watched it for a moment, his eyes following not just the bird, but something deep within an old memory. He stood up and went inside. When he returned, he was holding a worn folder, its pages yellowed and slightly curled like they'd been handled through many sleepless nights. Take a look, he said, placing it on Eric's lap, eyes still fixed on the empty space ahead. Every line in there is a cry that got buried. 6 years ago it was Kane, other kids, same kinds of injuries. But everyone stayed quiet. See if there's a name in there that keeps you up at night. Eric turned the pages slowly, reading through faded writing signatures that trembled, written by parents unaccustomed to filing complaints. There was a blurry photo of a teenager with his head caught between the frame of a police car door, blood trickling from the corner of his mouth. There was a half-missing complaint letter with no return address. Notes scribbled in pencil had long since faded. How did you manage to hold on to all of this? Eric asked, his voice hoarse. Michael took a slow sip of water before answering. Because I don't believe in apologies. I believe in the people who choose to do the right thing before it's too late, and because if I don't keep it, no one else will. A single leaf fell to the ground at Eric's feet. There was no wind, but something inside him had shifted. He held the file tighter, as if it could somehow hold on to the dignity of a profession he once believed couldn't be corrupted. Emily came out again, this time carrying a hand towel. She placed it gently on the stair rail and turned away without a word. Eric stepped forward and picked it up. Just a piece of cloth, but it carried the weight of a second chance. You have a daughter? Eric said quietly, still looking down at the towel. If one day someone hurt her and the person nearby said nothing, what would you think of that person? Michael didn't answer right away. After a long pause, he said, I'd think that person forgot what it means to be human. Silently, Eric closed the file, his hand still resting on the cover, like he wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. He didn't promise to return it. He didn't try to explain. Michael glanced at him but didn't ask, didn't demand it back. For those who've been betrayed by broken promises, one more word isn't what they need. They wait to see what's actually done, not what's said. As Eric placed his hand on the gate latch, Emily was still standing in the doorway. She didn't smile, and she didn't look away. The silence between them wasn't distance anymore, but something like a question left unspoken. In the slight tilt of her head was a kind of waiting, not rushed, not demanding, but deep enough to make Eric feel that he had to move forward, not just for justice, but because of that look. He smiled and gave a small bow, and this time, it was a real goodbye. As he walked through the gate, Eric moved slowly, as if each step needed time to absorb everything that still had no name. He didn't look at his phone. He didn't glance back. He just lowered his shoulders slightly, like letting go of a weight that had no shape. His lips moved barely, as if speaking only to himself. Where do you even begin if you want to save something that's already rotted from the inside? In the yard, Michael stood still, watching him go. He didn't have the answer, but he knew that the young man walking away from this house had just begun to find it. The sound of water dripping from the kitchen sink suddenly felt off. Michael Reese paused mid-swipe with the mop and tilted his head to listen. It wasn't the water that caught his attention, but the strange stillness in the air, as if something familiar had just vanished without warning. Emily usually hovered near the edge of the table while he cleaned the patio, or sat coloring the lids of old spice jars before proudly showing off her creations like trophies. This morning, there was no child's voice echoing through the house, no quick footsteps darting across the yard, no faint smell of glue from her latest crafts, just silence, dry and hollow. Emily. His voice wasn't loud, but it slid across the brick walls, crept into the corners, and fell flat against the cold tile floor. No answer. He stopped by the hammock where her small pajama top was still draped over one side. The tiny room felt like a warning, a reminder that not everyone leaves a goodbye when they disappear. Michael stepped outside, eyes scanning the alley like a soldier searching for a missing comrade. From the balcony on the second floor, Mrs. Carol Jenkins, the elderly neighbor with frazzled silver hair wrapped in a thin cardigan, looked down and called out just as he was about to break into a run. I saw two people wearing white coats, probably medical. They came really early. Took Emily with them. A van was parked out front, didn't catch the plates. They said it was an emergency order from the clinic. I asked, and they told me it was mandatory protocol, no need for prior notice. Michael didn't ask anything else. He turned, walked fast, then broke into a run. Mrs. Jenkins called after him, "Is something wrong?" But he didn't respond. Every step he took cracked open layers of tension that had been packed down for too long. At Ridgefield Community Clinic, the receptionist looked at him like a man out of place. The clerk opened the appointment log and frowned when Michael gave Emily's name, then closed it again, his tone flat. "There's no one by that name on today's list, sir. You might be at the wrong location." Michael leaned forward and gently placed Emily's ID card on the counter. His voice wasn't loud, but every word landed with the weight of stone. "No one takes my daughter without a record. If she wasn't scheduled, then who gave the order?" The receptionist began dialing internal lines. Each call came with a new furrowed brow. Every hang-up brought a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. Eventually, someone whispered through the line. They may have taken her to the overflow screening site behind the old Ridgeview Medical Annex. That place has been handling off-protocol cases for the past few weeks. The so-called temporary screening facility had no signage, just a row of squat buildings, off-white and gray, with half-closed wooden doors and the lingering scent of antiseptic hanging like an unwelcome guest. Michael stepped inside. He didn't ask for permission. He didn't wait for directions. Behind each door he passed, he heard the low murmur of children, muffled crying, the scuff of tired shoes dragging across tile. Room 4 was slightly ajar, and he stopped. Inside, Emily stood barefoot on the cold tile floor, a thin towel wrapped around her body. Her eyes were wide, filled with panic, as if she had never been taught to see the world with trust. A doctor was asking her something, but Michael didn't hear it. He didn't need to. He lifted his daughter into his arms. Emily didn't resist. Her small arms wrapped around his neck as if the only world left was the one where he stood. The pale, patchy spots on her back spread like maps not yet allowed to exist. Whose name was written on this order, and who thought they had the right to take my daughter without saying a word to me? His voice fell over the room like a bell, snapping everyone into attention. A middle-aged nurse stammered. Officer Mitch Sanders made the request. He said the father had refused to cooperate before, and because the girl's skin had abnormal markings, she needed to be separated for a medical check. No one asked further. Michael stared directly at the nurse. His gaze alone was enough to freeze every motion in the room. An administrative seizure of a child, no written notice, no social worker, no parent present, and you call that health care? No one answered, not a single word. Michael turned and walked out, holding Emily tightly, as if her small warmth was the last barrier between human decency and coldness. A few staff members stood frozen eyes wide, too stunned to move. Some avoided his gaze, some fidgeted with their white coats, but no one dared utter an apology. On the way home, Emily leaned her head on her father's shoulder and asked softly, "Daddy, if I didn't have this skin thing, would they have let me stay home?" Michael didn't answer right away. He thought about the stares of the adults, the whispers when his daughter passed by the playground, and the invisible scars he knew would run deeper than any white mark on her small body. "You don't need to be healed to belong at home, sweetheart. You just need to grow up knowing you never have to ask permission to be respected." Emily nodded. She didn't understand all of it, but Michael knew she would remember. That night, Michael didn't turn on the radio. He didn't set out an extra plate at the table. He wiped the wooden surface with the same familiar damp cloth, then folded the tablecloth with the embroidered cotton flower that Emily once drew. An old oil lamp sat in the center of the table, silent witness to the day. He tore a page from his old field notebook. The ink came from a pen that had barely survived since the last thank you letter he wrote to the hospital for his wife. His hand trembled slightly, but the handwriting was steady and sharp, as if each letter had been carved from discipline and grief. "My name is Michael Reese. I once served in the military, and now I'm just a father trying to understand why my daughter was treated as though she were something to be avoided simply because her skin does not look like what people are used to seeing. I am not asking for an apology, because words cannot wash away the fear my daughter has endured. What I demand is a legal system clear-eyed and humane enough to understand that a child should never be defined by what is different on their skin, but by the courage they must summon to face this world." Emily didn't ask why they had to go somewhere at that hour. She just quietly tugged down her sleeve to cover her wrist where the metal cuff had once left a faint mark. Over Michael's shoulder, the cloth folder bag swayed gently, but it wasn't nearly as heavy as what he was carrying inside the silence of his daughter. Rachel wasn't the kind of lawyer who spoke in cold legal terms. She poured a glass of water, tucked an extra pillow behind Emily's back with her own hands, and then asked softly, "How did you feel that day?" Emily shifted slightly but didn't raise her face. Michael didn't answer for her. He placed his hand on her back and waited, as if whatever came next would arrive when it was ready. Silence passed between them for several heartbeats before the little girl pressed her lips together and murmured, "I didn't know I did anything wrong. I was just riding my bike." Rachel nodded, pulled out a small voice recorder and placed it on the table without turning it on. She asked, "Are you afraid of the police?" "Emily," the girl nodded. "Because they yelled at you?" Emily shook her head. "Because they looked at the marks on my skin before they looked at my eyes. They didn't ask my name. They didn't ask if I was hurt. They just looked at me like I was something they shouldn't touch." Michael gently squeezed her shoulder. In that moment, he seemed to understand that some wounds don't show on the body but still keep people awake at night. A child may not remember every word that was said, but they will remember exactly how it felt to be made small and meaningless. Rachel opened the folder bag and carefully flipped through the papers Michael had brought. The old incident reports were yellowed with age, a few faded photos, some handwritten complaints. Everything was neatly organized, as if each document was a piece of memory that needed to be preserved. She skimmed through the rough handwriting, then looked up. "These came from old internal reports, right? Holding on to this, that's not easy." Michael nodded. A man who was forced into early retirement. I believe he still held on to his integrity. A soft knock came at the door, like someone outside was choosing each tap with care. Eric appeared in the doorway, clutching a folder wrapped tight in a worn rubber band. He stepped inside, pausing as his eyes met Emily's. That glance lasted no more than a breath, but it held something close to regret, like he had seen a truth that couldn't be erased and couldn't forgive himself for letting it happen. "I brought the final report," Eric said. "This one has my signature on it. I can't go back and change what happened, but at the very least, I can make sure it doesn't stay buried." Rachel took the folder and began reading through it. Silence filled the room as she read. In that small space, there were no car horns, no voices from the street, just the sound of turning pages and the quiet breathing of adults relearning how to believe in justice. Rachel closed the file and looked over at Emily. "We need to hear from the child, not because of the law, but because of our conscience. What happened to her shouldn't just become another statistic in a report." She turned to Michael. "We can't let this story end with a few lines on paper." Emily looked up. Her eyes seemed as if they had just been cleared by something unspoken. "What if people hate me? Should I still say it?" Michael didn't answer right away. He studied his daughter's eyes as if trying to see into a place where children grow up faster than they should. If someone doesn't like you because you told the truth, that doesn't make you wrong. You don't have to shout for everyone to hear. You just need to say enough so that you don't forget who you are. And if you stay silent someday, even you might forget what hurt you. Rachel reached out her hand without rushing. "Emily, you can speak however you want. It doesn't have to be the perfect words, just what you feel." Michael turned to Eric. "Do you know she didn't scream that day?" Eric nodded, uneasy. "I thought she was scared." Michael said no. She believed that if she stayed quiet, they'd go easy on her. She didn't know that sometimes silence lets violence happen again. Eric swallowed hard. He lowered his voice. "I don't deserve to be trusted, but I'm not here today to ask for your forgiveness. I'm here to stand on the right side." The small recorder clicked softly as it turned on. Emily looked at it, then at her father, then at Rachel. She sat up a little straighter, her small hands clenched tightly on her knees. Her voice wasn't loud, but it was clear, unexpectedly firm. "I don't know why that man looked at me like that. Maybe it was my skin, or because I didn't look him in the eyes. But I know when someone held my hand like they were going to break it, I really wanted to scream. If anyone did that to my dad, I would scream as loud as I could. I don't want to scare people, but I also don't want anyone to forget that I'm a real person." Rachel didn't ask anything else. She turned off the recorder gently as if she were blowing out a candle after a quiet prayer. A little later, as they were getting ready to leave, Eric stepped forward and spoke to Michael. "I know I didn't step in when I should have, but if you need someone standing behind you at the next hearing, I'll be there. And if they ask for testimony, I'll be the one to speak." Michael didn't shake his hand. He simply placed a hand on Eric's shoulder with the quiet steadiness of someone who knows the cost of silence. Courage doesn't always show up on time, but when it does, it can still save what isn't too far gone. Emily reached out and held her father's hand. For the first time, she was the one to do it. Her small, fragile fingers gripped tightly as if to say, "I've already begun." Rachel tucked the file into her bag and zipped it shut. "We won't let this be folded up like yesterday's newspaper." Outside, the sound of church bells echoed across the old rooftops as if reminding everyone of what should be held close to the heart. Michael leaned down and placed a kiss on Emily's forehead. He didn't say another word because in that look and that quiet gesture, everything important had already been spoken, not in words, but in the unconditional love of a father who had once walked through war to learn how to be gentle with his child. The director didn't speak when he entered. He walked straight to the head chair, pulled it back gently, and sat down silently as if listening to something only he could hear. The others followed one by one, none of them saying a word. The room was sealed tight, and even the sound of a footstep echoed as if testing everyone's conscience. Michael placed a stack of documents in front of him. His hand remained on the folder as though letting go might cause the words inside to slip away along with his fragile trust in justice. Eric sat in the chair nearest the wall, avoiding eye contact with Maurice, but unable to escape the heavy presence of Sergeant Cook. Rachel sat between the two men, her eyes steady but not cold. She reached into her bag, pulled out a small voice recorder, and placed it on the table without introduction. No one asked anything. They all knew each person here had brought either a reason to stay silent or a reason to speak up. Maurice was the first to break the silence, as if he had been waiting to define the narrative himself. "I acted according to protocol. Children showing signs of skin disease need to be evaluated immediately, especially if there's a risk to the community. No one was injured. No one died. This was a health safety response." His voice was steady but lacked depth, like someone reciting a rehearsed line more than stating something they actually believed. No one replied. Rachel lowered her head slightly and pressed play on the recorder. Emily's voice came through quiet but clear, like it had been captured in a space where trust still hadn't been fully crushed. They asked me what my name was. I answered. They asked where I lived. I answered. Then they squeezed my hand into a metal ring. I didn't do anything. Eric sat upright. He didn't look at anyone. He placed both hands on the table. His brow lowered, but his voice didn't waver. I was on the scene. That child wasn't called out because of her actions. It was because of her skin. I was never taught that someone with a different skin condition should be monitored, and I was never taught that handcuffing a child is a normal reaction. Sergeant Cook sat up straight, his fingers interlocked. He didn't interrupt, just tilted his head slightly, glanced at Maurice, then at Eric, a long enough look to feel like a warning. But Eric didn't stop. Emily didn't scream. She didn't run, not until she was cornered in fear. That's not the behavior of a child breaking rules. That's the reaction of a child who doesn't understand why she's being treated that way. And that fear, I believe, is going to stay with her longer than any scar. One sentence was enough to shift the atmosphere in the entire room. Michael still hadn't said a word. He simply observed each person across the table, his gaze like that of someone who had once commanded soldiers underground where there was no room for excuses. Each time he raised an eyebrow or tilted his head, it was like forcing the other person to take a hard look at themselves. Finally, the director spoke. His voice was calm and low, like water running over stone, but it didn't allow anything to slide past. Officer Kane, do you have any images, reports, or written documentation verifying the danger the child posed? Beltran lowered his head slightly. There's no specific image, but I clearly observed signs of concern. So you have no concrete evidence to prove the child posed any risk? The director interrupted, his voice steady but firm. Without evidence, every action becomes a matter of personal judgment, not justice. Brr. Rachel nodded gently and slid another file across the table toward the director. This is the medical report from the local clinic conducted by an independent dermatologist. Emily carries no contagious condition. She has a benign skin condition common in children and completely harmless to others. What worries me more than the marks on her skin is the blurry way we judge people. When emotion overrides reason, what we call the law becomes distorted. Raymond folded his hands in front of him and tilted his head slightly toward Beltran. But Beltran remained silent, no longer making eye contact. It wasn't remorse. It was as if he finally realized he had nothing left to stand on. The director capped his pen with a quiet, decisive click, the kind of sound that echoed like a lock snapping shut from the inside. No one needed to say anything. Everyone in the room felt it. The silence of justice wasn't acceptance, but the final declaration of a system that had at last awakened. In the eyes of those who had once watched injustice being swept under the rug, a fragile glimmer of hope appeared that truth, even late, was the only force strong enough to erase the darkness bred by fear. I don't care how many years you've served or who your father was. A police officer's job is to protect, not to instill fear. Mauricio Beltran, you are hereby suspended from duty until the investigation is concluded. No one said another word. The director's voice was no longer a command. It was a conclusion. And the meeting room, like a space after a storm, was filled only with the quiet breathing of those who now knew they had to choose again what was right. When a grown man in uniform bends down to cuff a child, it is no longer about protocol. It is a verdict on the very society that raised that man. And if no one speaks up in a room like this today, then tomorrow the sound of a child crying behind a closed door will be just another noise in a world too used to injustice. One wrongful act, if dodged or dressed up in noble words, will quietly birth more handcuffs for the next generation. And not every child will have the voice, the place, or the luck to ever tell their story in a room full of people who claim to stand for justice. Some things used to feel like a passing breeze, but when heard again in the voice of a child, suddenly the adults had nowhere left to hide. I'm not afraid of being sick. I'm afraid of being treated like I'm not a person. Emily's words didn't sound like a speech. They weren't delivered to win sympathy. Her voice was calm, strangely steady, like she had practiced it over and over in her mind before finally daring to say it out loud. There was something dry, something rough in her tone, like someone swallowing a shard of memory before they were ready to face it. The only one who stepped out with her was her father, Michael. He didn't walk quickly, nor did he look at anyone in the crowded schoolyard. His eyes still held that weight of a soldier, the kind that looks straight ahead without waiting for forgiveness. But the way he rested his hand gently on his daughter's shoulder showed he wasn't leading her. He was walking alongside someone who was just learning how to say something she had never been allowed to speak. The coordinator of the assembly raised the microphone, his voice soft as if trying to shorten the distance between the podium and the rows of students below. Before we begin the main program, we have a student who'd like to say a few words. It won't take long, but I think it's something we should all hear. Emily didn't step up onto the wooden stage. She just stood in the middle of the brick courtyard. A few whispers floated out from the rows of folding chairs. Then, a boy's voice spoke not loudly, but loud enough for several people to hear. "Isn't she the one with that weird disease?" No one scolded the boy. No one repeated what he had said either. But that silence, without any correction or defense, made the air in the courtyard feel thick, as if something had gotten stuck in the throats of every adult present. Emily didn't look anyone in the eye. She kept her gaze fixed on the brick wall at the back of the yard where a banner hung that read, "We are a community that excludes no one." I have a skin condition, some of you already know, but I didn't come here to ask you not to be scared of it. I just hope adults stop teaching kids that being different means being bad. Her voice remained steady, not trembling, but each word she let go cut through the pride of the grown-ups like little shards of glass. No one pointed out the cuts, but everyone could feel them stinging just beneath the surface. A few parents shook their heads and turned to whisper to one another. One mother opened her mouth to say something, but her daughter tugged at her sleeve and whispered, "I think she's really brave." Emily continued, her tone unchanged. "I used to want to disappear, because every time I walked into my old classroom, people looked at me like I was polluting the air. But now I don't want to disappear anymore. Because my dad told me that people might step back because they're afraid, but we can stand still because we care." From the front row, a faint sob escaped. A man pulled a tissue from his shirt pocket. An older teacher with glasses covering half her face placed her hand over her chest as if trying to calm something inside. A boy glanced down at his shoes, then slowly pulled a small snack from his backpack and placed it on the step near Emily, like an unspoken apology. Eric Dawson sat at the very back row, not in uniform, trying to blend into the crowd at the school courtyard that day. His name wasn't on the list of speakers, and he had no official reason to step forward. But when the principal's eyes landed on him, not for long, not urgently, but like a silent invitation, he understood. He stood up slowly, walked over, and stopped beside Emily. He didn't shield her, didn't prompt her. He just stood there like someone bearing witness to what needed to be heard. "I'm a police officer," he began. "But before that, I was a kid who didn't dare speak up when I saw my friend pushed out of a game just for being different. When I grew up, I stayed silent again when I saw injustice happen right in front of me. Today, I'm standing here not to fix the past, but to relearn what it means to do the right thing." He looked around slowly. There were times when we pretended not to see what was wrong, just to keep things peaceful. But if we choose to stay silent today, that's not ignorance anymore. That's a choice. The air thickened. A young mother holding a toddler stood up suddenly and spoke loudly. "I'm sorry. I pulled my daughter's application from this class because I was afraid she'd catch something. But I was wrong. I was so wrong." A woman across the courtyard bowed her head and pulled her mask up higher, trying to hide the shame in her eyes. On the opposite side, a middle-aged man stepped forward slowly, his hands clasped together. His voice wasn't loud but clear enough to make the crowd fall still. "I was a victim when I was a kid. They called me Shorty and locked me in the bathroom. But I chose to forget instead of speaking out. Today I want to apologize for the children I didn't have the courage to protect." When the assembly ended, no one rushed to leave. Many students came to shake Emily's hand. A little girl asked, "Do you want to play dolls with me?" Emily didn't answer right away, because just then, an elderly teacher with silver hair walked over. She didn't say anything at first. She just held Emily's hand and kept holding it for a long time. "I was like you when I was little, but I stayed quiet for a very long time." Emily looked at her for a while, then smiled gently. "You're not quiet anymore." People often think children don't understand, but sometimes what a child chooses to say is exactly what adults have spent their whole lives avoiding. Sometimes courage doesn't come from fighting back. It comes from standing up and telling the truth in the softest voice when everyone else is silent. The sky that day still held a trace of morning fog, like the last hesitation of darkness before it leaves. But what everyone felt even more clearly than sunlight was this truth: some wounds don't need bandages. They just need someone brave enough to name them, and someone else strong enough not to look away. Emily still remembered exactly how it felt when the cold metal of the handcuffs clamped down on her wrists that day. The marks had faded, but what stayed with her wasn't the physical pain. It was the suspicion in the eyes of the adults around her. Their silence had weighed heavier than any accusation. But today, she sat in the hallway of the headquarters with her small backpack resting on her lap, no longer trembling inside. She had learned something that some fears couldn't be avoided. You just had to walk through them without bowing your head. The past 3 weeks had been full of turmoil, but none of the people involved had spoken to the press or posted on social media. There were no slogans, no protests, only reports, testimonies, and quiet meetings. It was all silent, but precise, like a blade of truth cutting through the dark. In closed-door sessions, people had stopped avoiding each other's eyes. The hesitant phone calls at the beginning had become firm statements. And Michael Reese, who had once believed that silence was the best way to protect his daughter, had come to understand that sometimes speaking up was the only way to protect her at all. The special session of the review board started right on time. No one was late and no one left in a hurry. The meeting room was larger than before, chairs spaced evenly, each person with their own file. Eric Dawson sat near the end of the table to the right of Rachel Monroe, who had stayed silent all morning, simply listening. Michael sat across from Eric, his expression calm, hands folded on the table, like he was holding his heart in place. No one knew exactly what would be announced, but everyone knew there would be no turning back. The chairman of the board was a man with graying hair and a slow, deliberate voice that couldn't be mistaken for anyone else's. He opened the folder in front of him. He didn't rush, didn't pause, just spoke steadily as if reading a promise meant for the next generation. After thorough examination, collection of evidence, and cross-checking of all testimonies, the disciplinary board has reached the following decision. Maurice Kane is hereby permanently dismissed from the police department for abuse of power, discrimination, serious violations of the Code of Professional Conduct, and most importantly, for endangering the emotional well-being of a minor who was unable to defend herself. At the far end of the table, someone let out a quiet sigh. But no one nodded. No one clapped. It wasn't satisfaction people felt. It was more like the removal of a collar they didn't know they'd been wearing. Everyone remained seated a little longer, letting the slow weight of the truth sink in. Officer Mitch Sanders is hereby suspended indefinitely for unauthorized intervention in the medical examination of a child conducted without an order from a legitimate health authority and without the consent of the child's guardian. His use of public safety as a cover to infringe upon personal rights will be subject to further investigation under a separate process. In the corner of the room, Maria Collins, a longtime clerk, sat with her head slightly bowed, recording each word with the care of someone who had witnessed far too many overlooked rulings. She was the one who once left a pre-filled form on Eric Dawson's desk with only one handwritten note. Be careful. You're on the right side. Sergeant Raymond Cook, upon being notified of the ongoing investigation, submitted his resignation from the force. In his handwritten letter, he wrote only one sentence. The chairperson paused. No one spoke. The room held its breath. I no longer have the right to teach anyone what's right. Michael Reese lowered his head slightly. In his eyes there was no trace of pity, only the quiet solemnity of someone who understood that admitting one's mistake at the right time could also be an act of courage. Those who once stood at the top of a system meant to uphold justice now sat before a truth that left no room for excuses. And even though it had come late, it was still a necessary step toward healing. The chair paused briefly, then continued. In addition to disciplinary decisions, the committee has agreed to invite several individuals to participate in the task force for structural reform of public service. We respectfully invite Mr. Michael Reese to serve as a civilian representative. He is a former soldier, the father of a child harmed by the silence of the system, and a man who chose not to remain silent anymore. Michael did not respond immediately. He simply looked quietly at the nameplate on the envelope in front of him. The printed letters were crisp and clean, but still not enough to express everything he had endured. Because sometimes the greatest acts of valor come without medals, and the only reward is the look of trust in a child's eyes when the world still feels uncertain and frightening. Rachel Monroe was also invited to speak, not to talk about the law, but to talk about belief. "I've accepted the offer to become a guest lecturer at the police academy," she said. "But I won't start with the first statute. I'll start by asking my students, if there were no laws, what would you choose to do as right?" The atmosphere in the room softened like the air after a rainstorm when the rainbow hasn't appeared yet, but the fear has already faded. One person stood up, then another. No one clapped, no one offered congratulations. They simply packed up their files in silence, as if after 3 long weeks they could finally breathe a long, unburdened sigh. Eric Dawson stood up last. He picked up his document case without looking at anyone, and without needing anyone to look back. The meeting room door closed behind him so gently it was almost inaudible. At the end of the hallway, Emily Reese was sitting. Her small backpack rested neatly beside her, her feet swinging and tapping softly against the edge of the stone bench. When she saw Eric, she didn't speak. She just raised her hand and waved. The plastic bracelet on her wrist made a soft sound, like wind brushing past a chime. Eric walked faster. He didn't say much. He simply smiled, bent down, and asked softly, "Did I keep you waiting?" Emily nodded, then shook her head, then smiled mischievously. Eric scratched his head. "Today I'm not the rookie anymore." There are moments when a single sentence is enough to carry the weight of an entire journey. And in the pale morning light filling that hallway, the two of them, one grown, one still small, walked side by side toward the glass doors that opened into the light, no longer afraid of the darkness behind them. Emily burst into laughter as the front wheel of her bike wobbled slightly, as if it too were learning how to balance. Michael kept his hand gently at her back, not pushing, just holding it there, a silent promise that if she needed him, he would be there to catch her. But Emily didn't look back. She shouted joyfully, "I did it, Daddy. I can ride on my own." Emilio stood near the garden gate, a rusty watering can in hand, watching each slow turn of Emily's bike wheels. Behind him, the whitewashed wall flickered with the morning sun. Pale purple flowers had begun to sprout across the soil land that once was a deserted police parking lot, now transformed into a community garden named after Emily. People from the neighborhood started coming by. At first, just to see if someone really had the nerve to plant flowers on land once deemed contaminated. Then they returned, bringing watering cans, bags of compost, a few seed packets. No one said anything out loud, but each time they bent to water the plants, it was as if they were telling themselves that no child should ever have their softness stolen from them. Mrs. Norma Blake, who ran the corner store, quietly placed 2 pots of succulents at the edge of the plot without a word. Mr. Peter Whitman, who had once objected to Emily attending school with his son, was now the one who came every morning to water the plants. A boy around 7 in a faded t-shirt watched Emily for a while before turning to Emilio and asking in a hushed voice, "Mister, is it true she got handcuffed once Emilio didn't answer right away?" He set the watering can down and crouched beside the boy. Back then, a lot of people didn't understand her condition, so they misjudged her. They looked but didn't ask, and that kind of mistake just kept repeating itself. The boy thought for a moment, then nodded as if something inside him had finally clicked into place. Before he could say more, Michael approached his hands, still dusted with soil from the small shovel he'd been using. "No," Michael said. She wasn't arrested. She was dismissed. And then she forgave them. That's the hardest part. Emilio looked at the old soldier and gave a quiet nod. In the sunlight catching both their lined foreheads, there was something unspoken, a kind of respect that didn't need explaining. At the far end of the garden on the white wall, there was a large mural painted by hand, nervous and determined strokes from the student volunteers of Hopeview Elementary. It showed two hands, one large and one small, touching a pair of metal handcuffs, not breaking them with force, but opening them with will. Emily often sat beneath that mural after school, laying out her colored pencils and drawing on the cracked tiles. When someone asked her what she was drawing, she would reply simply, "I'm practicing drawing things that don't exist yet, like a place where people don't look at me with fear." One afternoon, while Emilio was planting a new row of vegetables, Mr. Whitman walked over, scratching his head, clearly uneasy. "I used to say she shouldn't be in the same class as my boy. I was afraid because I didn't understand. But now, I know I was wrong. I hope you won't hold it against me." Michael was quiet for a moment, then reached out his hand. The handshake wasn't for forgiveness, it was to acknowledge a new beginning. In that moment between two men who had once stood on opposite sides of a wall made of fear, something softened. No apology was needed in words, because sometimes a slow and steady handshake is enough for a narrow heart to find its way back to something wider. That night, after Emily had fallen asleep, Michael opened the wooden drawer and pulled out a letter he had written by hand. The ink was blue, the handwriting shaky but deliberate, like the way he used to fold his uniform before transferring to a new post. The letter was sealed in an envelope bearing a single name, Sarah. "Sarah, today I took our daughter to school on her bike. She didn't need my hand anymore. She laughed like there had never been a mark on her wrist. People say I'm a brave father, but the truth is, she's the brave one. She forgave a town that made her cry, and somehow that town learned how to say sorry. Do you see, she's stronger than I ever was. She didn't need a uniform to fight." Michael bowed his head slowly and placed the envelope on the stone ledge beneath the mango tree, where Sarah used to sit and read the paper on warm, sunny afternoons. The bench was moss-covered now, but the memories still held their shape. The wind drifted through the leaves, carrying the scent of sap, old paper, and damp earth. As if memory too had its own fragrance, one only those who had waited long enough could recognize. Emily didn't stand up. She quietly sat, folding each paper petal and arranging them into a circle, as if trying to build a small home out of fragrance. She looked up at her classmates, her eyes no longer avoiding theirs, but calm and steady. If you see someone who's not like you, don't turn away so quickly. Try getting a little closer. You might find out they're just waiting to be your friend. Another girl walked up and gently placed her hand on Emily's shoulder. "I used to be afraid of people not wanting to be around me. But now, I don't want to be afraid anymore." That night, after the whole neighborhood had gone dark, Michael sat down to reread something Emily had written in her composition notebook. "If I were the wind, I'd blow into grown-up hearts so they'd know that kids have sadness too." He closed the notebook and smiled as if he could hear Sarah's voice whispering beside him. The next morning, Emily carried her bowl of porridge out to the porch and sat quietly on the steps. As she neared the end, she looked up at her father with hesitation. "Daddy, when will I stop being sick?" Michael sat beside her. He didn't answer right away. He gently wrapped his arms around her, resting his face in her hair, which still smelled like kids' soap. "You don't need to stop being sick to be happy, sweetheart, because you've already taught me that strength isn't about your skin or your scars. It's about the heart that knows how to forgive." A light breeze rustled the young leaves on the windowsill, carrying the scent of wildflowers and the soft sound of pages turning inside the house. No one said anything else, because some truths are complete just by being held in love and quiet renewal. Not everyone has the courage to stand up for justice, especially when the one in the wrong wears the very uniform meant to symbolize authority. But Michael Reese, a former soldier used to gunfire, and silence chose to speak out not with force, but with the love of a father. And what shook the police department wasn't just his immediate response. It was the way he made an entire town learn the meaning of compassion again through the clear, steady eyes of a child. This story isn't just about a father and daughter. It's a reminder that good people are never truly alone. Those who cause harm will eventually face the consequences, and those who choose to forgive will plant the seeds of hope for the ones who come next. And what about you? Have you ever witnessed something unfair and stayed silent? Or have you ever stood up for someone who had no one else share your story in the comments below? Because maybe the story you tell today could be the small spark someone out there needs to stand tall. Thank you for staying with us on this journey. How are you feeling today? How did your day go? Don't forget to take care of yourself. And if this story touched your heart, leave a heart hit subscribe so we can meet again in the next stories filled with kindness and humanity.